After a week's break from our continuous reading of John chapter 6 to celebrate the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, we return this week to the conclusion of the Bread of Life discourse. During our continuous reading, I have been mentioning the very sad statistics when it comes to Catholics and their belief in the Eucharist. 70% of churchgoers not believing in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. And because the Eucharist is the sacrament of sacraments, the source and summit of our faith, we also see the effects of that lack of belief. A consistent downward trend in the sacramental data throughout North America. These spiritual affairs also cause some pretty harsh realities for the temporal affairs in the church. 10% of congregations doing 90% of the volunteering. That was a pre-COVID stat. Only know what that's going to look like after this. 10% of congregations providing 90% of the offertory in most parishes. This has forced the number of dioceses to cluster and amalgamate parishes due to rapidly dwindling congregations. Take a trip to Quebec City and you'll see that reality. How do we reverse these sad statistics? First things first. Our worship and our worthy reception of the Eucharist. If we get this wrong, nothing will have substance and nothing will last. Why? It comes down to one word: covenant. Our personal relationship with God. The first reading from the 24th chapter of the book of Joshua puts us at the end of the book and the end of Joshua's life. Joshua is the man chosen by the Lord to succeed Moses as the leader of the people and lead them into the promised land. In the promised land, Joshua would lead the conquest of the enemies, the people of the land, and oversee that the 12 tribes divide and settle the land equally. After the 12 tribes divided out the land and before his death, Joshua once again gathers them all together. Their elders, their leaders, their officials, their judges, and recounts the covenant that God entered into with them at Mount Sinai, and how God is ever faithful to his covenant. He also recounts how their ancestors were not faithful to God and the covenant, from the golden calf and their disobedience in the wilderness. But God, being ever faithful to his people, now wants to renew that covenant. If you are unwilling to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. Effectively, choose the God who delivered you and gave you this land, or forsake God. Joshua's response, often quoted, gives us a response that we should meditate on daily in our personal relationship with God. As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Joshua would then perform a covenant renewal ritual, and each tribe would go off to their allotted land. But if you have been hearing me over the past weeks, months, you know the narrative. They did not serve the Lord, their God. They went off and continually, over and over again, were unfaithful to God and served the Baals and the Asheroths. But God, ever faithful to the covenant he established, would in the fullness of time send his only begotten Son, Jesus Christ, into the world. And as Joshua would bring the 12 tribes into the promised land, so Jesus, through his cross and resurrection, the new and eternal covenant established in his flesh and blood, would bring us into heaven. It is in this context where we go to the first line of the gospel. Very truly, I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Jesus is speaking both literally and sacramentally, giving us a sacramental realism that does not mean cannibalism, but does not mean symbolism either. It means that by eating his flesh and drinking his blood, we are entering into the new and eternal covenant, a true intimate exchange of persons. As we offer our life to God, God is filling us with his divine life. He is lifting us up to become sharers in the divine nature. This is a hard teaching to accept. Many disciples, after hearing it, walked away. And as we see in various periods of history, and in our own time, this was not the last time people walked away. But here, like Joshua, Jesus poses an even graver question to us after revealing the faithfulness of God. Will you also go away? Like Joshua, Peter responds, Lord, to whom shall we go? Can we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and know that you are the Holy One of God. Like Joshua, who didn't know the consequences of serving God, but realized God's faithfulness and committed to it, Peter is not saying he understands this hard teaching. He is saying, Lord, I trust you more than myself, because you are God, and you are faithful, and I will follow you. It is on the response of Joshua and Peter that we find ourselves this day and the reversal of the sad statistics. To live in this personal relationship with God. How is this lived? St. Paul, in his letter to the Ephesians, presents us with what Pope St. John Paul II frequently spoke, the nuptial character of the Eucharist. He writes, the Eucharist is the sacrament of our redemption. It is the sacrament of the bridegroom and of the bride. We, with our own vertical mindedness and human sinfulness, get caught up with the language of wives, be subject to your husbands, and then turn off. Yet St. Paul is inviting every wife in the way she relates to her husband to reflect the church herself, who is always subject to Christ. The husband, for his part, is asked to be subject to his wife, for he is a reflection of Jesus Christ, who offered himself up even to death on a cross out of love for the church. And through this mutual entrusting of spouses to each other, St. Paul is revealing the covenant, the personal relationship we have with God. As members of the church, the bride of Christ, that means all of us baptized have to be subject to Christ, to his teaching. When he says, I am the bread of life, very truly I tell you, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you will have no life within you. We humble ourselves and entrust our intellect to him. As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Why? Because Christ is the head of the body, the church, the bridegroom who loves us so much that he emptied himself and sacrificed himself on the cross so that we can enter into the new and eternal covenant. In our reception of the Eucharist, then, is the deepest intimacy of personal relationship we can have with God on this side of eternity. The two become one flesh. God lifts me up into his divine nature by giving me his divine life. And I, in turn, give my whole heart to him. And from this mutual entrusting of persons, we see life given to the world. At the conclusion of the Bread of Life discourse, knowing those sad statistics, you can close your eyes and you can imagine yourself in the scene. See the multitudes who came to listen, those disciples. You can hear the words of the Master, I am the bread come down from heaven. Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life in you. We can see how many walked away. We know many of them in our families, our friends. We can place their faces in our minds. And now, hear Jesus speak. Will you also go away?